Welcome to a special edition of the Green and Red podcast. With the current crisis going on between Russia and Ukraine, we've decided to give a little bit more background. We did a big episode over the weekend, talking a lot about background on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine going on right now. But we wanted to also, there's a number of issues which really deserve even more attention. And so we're going to be doing these brief backgrounders on this. I'll say that this won't be a sort of days updates from the conflict in Ukraine, which, you can get from any, media outlet, but we want to be actually talking a little bit about the history and some of the economic situation and et cetera, et cetera. So I am going to pass it off to my co-host, Bob Bazenko.
Thanks, and please feel free to join in with any comments or ideas you have too. And thank you for all of you out there in listener and viewer land for supporting us too. We've been getting just over the weekend since we posted the big one we did on Friday, really good numbers. And today we will be, I'm very certain, very more brief than that. The other day we talked a lot about background. Yeah, like Scott said, there are countless sources for updates on a daily basis. And also, let me apologize if there's a little bit of shakiness. I'm, as I pointed out, I have some kind of I'm a little wounded here, so I'm sitting in a recliner chair rather than my normal desk. So, there are countless places where you can get daily updates. And what we want to do is provide kind of context and background that you won't get elsewhere. The main media, especially, has turned this into a morality play, which is very easy to do. I mean, Putin is obviously indefensible, and what is happening here is a clear violation of all kinds of international laws, and it is an act of aggression. And so it needs to be, we understand that. We're not, we're not Glenn Greenwald or whoever. But at the same time, things don't happen in a vacuum. And I think as a professor of history, that's really important to me. It's something I point out all the time. For instance, when I talk about 9/11 in my class, which is obviously a very big issue, I point out that, a bunch of people didn't wake up that morning and say, hey, let's go hijack planes and blow up the World Trade Center, right? That's the culmination of decades of conflict, in that particular case, in the Middle East. And, World War I or World War II were not culminations. We're not just kind of caused by, the assassination of the Archduke or a particular incident, but Scott has told me to try to get it closer to the mic, so I'm going to try to do that. Again, I'm sorry for this, but those weren't caused specifically by particular issues like the assassination of the Archduke or even the Anschluss or something like that. They're the culminations of decades of conflict, and in that particular case, the post-Versailles era. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And we did a little of that yesterday, Friday, where we focused a lot on NATO, and that's really a critical important. But I want to kind of continue that today, and especially focus on post-Soviet Russia. And then within that, more specifically focus on economic, the way the economy changed in Russia and the Russian Federation, and also then a little bit about economic relations between the United States and Russia and Ukraine. You don't have to agree with Putin. As I said, he should be condemned morally, absolutely. But when you take this anti-Putin line as to the extent that a lot of these NATO liberals do, what you're doing is you're advocating an expanded war. And that war is going to kill a bunch of young Russians and Ukrainians who are just fodder in all this, right? The subject class who fight all the battles, as Gene Debs would have said. So our point is not that Putin should be apologized for, but that this entire thing needs to be understood, and we ignore the larger context of it at our own peril. And so, and we want, ideally, I think as people on the left, as humans, actually, you just want to see less fighting, and you'd like to see some kind of negotiation, and you don't want this to continue and expand, especially, we've seen, kind of nuclear pontificating today and things like that, which is never a good sign. So anyway, one of the key issues here, and I want to talk about, is that Russia, and you don't have to agree with it. People can have bad reasons but they're still in a particular historical sense, they're credible or legitimate, even if they're not good reasons or they lead to bad things. And so the Russians clearly feel like they are encircled by enemies, both territorially and militarily, and also economically. And a lot of that stems from what happened in the post-1991 era. Now, the other day we talked a great deal about NATO and pointed out that that was seen as a provocation by Putin and others. And in fact, just since then, the other day I found an article from 2016 where William Perry, who had been Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, essentially said that in the early years of the post-Soviet Union, the United States really deserves much of he used the term blame for bad relations between the United States and Russia. And in 2016, he said that the current level of hostility at that point even was caused in large part by Washington's contemptuous treatment, which are Perry's terms, of Moscow security concerns. So even bad people, remember with Saddam Hussein, right? And Saddam Hussein wasn't a good guy, but there were security concerns, at stake there. Perry said that, when he was Secretary of Defense in the mid-90s, that cooperation had been improving rapidly, but then the issue of NATO really kind of took over and spoiled things really badly. And once NATO started to expand, especially into areas bordering Russia, then it really kind of created a big schism in U.S.-Russian relations, which up to that point had been decent. And Perry even pointed out that during a White House meeting to discuss the expansion of NATO, Perry, said that the U.S. needed to go slow and not alienate Russia, especially in the 90s. And we'll talk in a minute about what was happening inside Russia. Still hard not to say Soviet Union then. But he wanted to go slow with regard to NATO. And it was Richard Holbrooke who led the opposition. And more importantly, it was Al Gore who took a really hawkish line, who said, we can manage the problems we have with Russia. And basically, Gore and others said, who cares what the Russians think? They're a third-rate power. And Putin was obviously aware of that. And then kind of moving forward with this same point. And the other day we talked about 2014 in Kosovo. And I was looking around at some old WikiLeaks documents. And I found one from the Deputy Secretary of State, William Burns, in 2014, where he wrote back to the White House and Joint Chiefs of Staff and others, specifically with regard to the Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, which is an issue we talked about the other day. And in fact, the headline of that document is "Niet means Niet, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines." But kind of the key summary point here is that it says, following a muted first reaction to Ukraine's intent to seek a NATO membership action plan in the Bucharest summit. This is in 2008, I'm sorry. The summit took place in 2008. Foreign Minister Lavrov and other senior officials had reiterated strong opposition, stressing that Russia would view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat. NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains an, quote, emotional and neuralgic issue for Russia, but strategic policy considerations also underlie strong opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. And this is very similar to what Matlock had said. The famous diplomat George Frost Kennan said much the same in the 90s. Then one last point before I talk about the breakup of the Soviet Union, what happened then, and it's something I forgot totally the other day, was that in 2019, if we recall, Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the INF Treaty. And he did this against the strong reservations and opposition of the American intelligence community and the American defense community. And obviously, Putin didn't take well to this. And at the time, this is just in 2019, Putin said, instead of engaging in a meaningful discussion on international security matters, the United States opted for simply undercutting many years of efforts to reduce the probability of a large-scale armed conflict, including the use of nuclear weapons. And then Putin said, if Trump leaves this treaty and begins an escalation, we will respond in the same way. And once again, the point here isn't to validate Putin or in any way apologize for him, but to suggest that there's the much larger context here going on. And this goes back over 30 years. And I think it's really crucial to understand the Cold War, which was always portrayed as this epic battle between good and evil and morality and all that kind of stuff. If you ever read the documents, like especially something like NSC 68, or read about the Marshall Plan or the Truman Doctrine, it's portrayed as this epic battle between good and evil. But it's a battle of kind of how the world's economy is going to be structured. The United States in 1944 had established the Bretton Woods system, and the Eastern European countries were not part of that. They were excluded from it, which meant that the United States did not have access to that area of the world, which was pretty developed. And that's something important too, with regard to the context of this. And this kind of goes back to, for instance, World War I and why the Balkans were so important. And even today, today we're hearing a lot of people on the left point out the hypocrisy and contradictions of the United States getting so fervent about this, yet ignoring clearly equal, horrific deeds done in, by the Saudis in Yemen or in Palestine, or in many other places like that. And a lot of people on the left, the response becomes kind of, because it's racial, Libya and places like that are not white, and there clearly could be an element of that. But I think it's so important to remember, like the Balkans before World War I, what we're talking about today in Ukraine or in Georgia or in other areas like where NATO expanded, these areas are developed. They're not underdeveloped world. These are part of, they're not necessarily the core, but they're not peripheral either, like the so-called third world would be. They have been developed. They have more than just resources available to them, which makes them really important. So Ukraine, for instance, is going to be far more important in terms of the global economy than Yemen ever would be, or that Palestine ever would be. And so the United States is going to act there in defense of Ukraine for that reason as well. I mean, not to mention, obviously, the U.S. alliances with countries like Israel and Saudi, and and Israel and Saudi and Putin are not horribly distinct in any regard. They're all kind of pretty similar in that way. But at any rate, I think
doesn't he also have various pacts with the Saudis and the Israelis as well?
Oh yeah, Israel's a strong supporter. Yeah, absolutely. I'm just kind of trying to like I said, we're doing this more as historians right now than analysts or whatever, because I think you're going to kind of hear the same stuff from a lot of different people today or for all week. And so we want to just kind of take a different tack, because I think it's important to kind of understand this in the larger context. And if we're going to find some kind of solution to it, then kind of having some kind of historical analysis is fairly useful. So for years you had the Soviet Union, and the point of the Cold War was to create a new global world order, based on things like the Bretton Woods system and NSC 68 and other kinds of things. And what that meant was that the United States would have access to the resources of Eastern Europe for trade, for investment, and things like that. And that area is developed. That's not the third world. That's more, second world, if you want to call it that. It's not like, Britain and France and Germany and the United States, Western Germany and the United States, but it's clearly not part of, it's developed far more than, the countries of like Africa, Asia, or Latin America would be. And so what the United States throughout the Cold War was doing was trying to reopen those areas in Eastern Europe so that they could become part of this global political economy based on concepts like Bretton Woods and obviously private ownership of the means of production, private investment, no state funding or anything like that. I mean, if you had state institutions, then you weren't going to get IMF and World Bank help. And that's, I think, an important concept, because whether it be the Cold War or what we're talking about today, that's always going to be the Western purpose, which is to kind of create these privatized economic institutions. And clearly that wasn't happening in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had these state-run industries, state-run financial institutions. And so when things fall apart between 1989 and 1991, especially, a small group of Russians emerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union and took control of newly privatized companies. And this is really crucial. You had these state-run companies. You also had a state safety net, things like education and healthcare and all the kinds of stuff that most countries have, and the United States doesn't. And those kind of went away as well. So the Soviet Union took all of these state-run companies and began to privatize them. Margaret Thatcher did this, right, in Britain. It's nothing shocking. And because of that, a small group of very well-connected Russians, who we now refer to as oligarchs, and I've seen a lot of people complain that you call these people oligarchs, but we call people in the U.S. wealthy or whatever. Well, actually, we do call Americans oligarchs too. So, but they're oligarchic, and so you have this small group
The
of
billionaire class.
billionaire class, yeah. And so a lot of these people were connected in the old Soviet Union system. They were state agents, or they had military connections. They were like kind of nomenklatura. And so they obviously had the upper hand and were able to gain ownership once this privatization occurred in some of the world's most valuable, especially with regard to natural resources, petroleum, natural gas, and metal deposits. And there's a professor who's very mainstream, a guy named Marshall Goldman, who's a professor, I think like a George Kennan professor or something like that, or at a Kennan Institute, I can't remember. Yeah, it was at Harvard's Kennan Institute, I think. But Goldman, he's very mainstream, as establishment as you get, even said this resulted in one of the world's greatest transfers of wealth. So what you have is this creation of wealth now by taking public wealth away and handing it to a smallish group of individuals. In the early 2000s, 17 of the richest billionaires in the world were Russian. Just a few years, like 5 years before that, it was only 5. So you have this massive influx of wealth in the Soviet Union. And now you have this creation of this fairly smallish group of oligarchs, which replaces these state-run institutions, which clearly weren't running well, and they were corrupt, and they were especially by the 80s, when Gorbachev took over, they were pretty sclerotic, but they still were providing some rudimentary services for individuals. And there was still this kind of larger kind of public, sector. And that's eviscerated fairly quickly. And then this new Russian government, which remember, was heavily subsidized by the United States. Within 5 years, the Communist Party was poised for a comeback. And the U.S. pumped how much money into Boris Yeltsin's campaign? Remember that? Like
hundreds of millions, or
billions. It was a stunning. I mean, the United States poured all kinds of aid. The IMF poured all kinds of aid in order to get Yeltsin reelected. Because there was this fear that the communists were going to come back into take over the government. The new Russian government embarked on a reforms. Basically a regime of shock therapy, which, if you know anything about the IMF or if you follow these kinds of issues, is not uncommon. It's kind of the way things are generally done. And Western advisors who poured into Eastern Europe in 1991, all over the place, in every country in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, these Westerners came in, bankers, state officials, industrialists, to advise. If I had two hands, I would do air quotes with it, to advise these Eastern European governments. Immediately, advocated this kind of shock therapy regime. They, no price controls, privatize state-owned industries, and privatization in Russia mostly occurred with bigger companies. In 2000, only about 10 to 30% of the Russian GDP came from small businesses, compared to about half in Western states, which meant that these huge state-run conglomerates now were huge privately owned conglomerates. So, to make a long story a little more brief, a fairly smallish group of economic elites, these oligarchs, these billionaires, whatever you want to call them, emerged as the owners of these new companies, and they had immense wealth. And they were heavily concentrated in natural resource sectors like gas. But the consequences of shock therapy were really severe for Russia. The economy contracted by nearly 50% between 1991 and 1997, and Russia experienced hyperinflation. Now, that's also important politically because it led.
Can I say one real quick thing?
Yeah,
which is that this strategy of privatization that the international community, the International Monetary Fund has, this is not unique for Russia, this sort of shock therapy. This is actually what the IMF still does around the world. So it goes in, privatizes, has these agendas of austerity to basically do away with social services, public sector influence over people. And so it wasn't something they kind of just came up with for Russia. It's like, this is like their game plan since like the 40s.
Yeah, absolutely. IMF, dirty MF, takes away everything it can get, always leaves you on the, always leaves you on the hook with insupportable debt. So yeah, absolutely. No, this is yeah, it's the, it's basically the Cold War policy, right? This is kind of, this is what they've been waiting for. And amid the triumphalism of the Cold War in that era, most of it focused on democracy and freedom and all these kinds of things. But the reality was what won was was private capital, private investment in institutions like the IMF, which IMF and World Bank were created Bretton Woods. So, and that also politically is important because amid this chaos in Russia, there's an election in 1991, and who won that? Who won that election?
Boris Yeltsin.
No, it was Putin in 1990. I'm sorry, 1999. I'm sorry, my bad.
1999, it was Vladimir Putin. He was the mayor of St. Petersburg, right?
Putin, right. So Putin emerged from this chaos. And, everybody likes to make these comparisons to Hitler and all that, which are just, you need to check, like it's like Trump wasn't Hitler, Putin's not Hitler. Hitler's trying to take over all of Europe and ultimately all of the world. That does not compare at this point with Georgia and Ukraine. And Putin is a horrific guy, a dangerous guy. But actually, that's what happened in Germany in the 1930s too. Out of the chaos and the devastation of World War I, extreme ideologies took over and took root. And that's kind of, I think, one of the main points where you have, whenever you have this kind of crisis like that, you'll see, the emergence and the strengthening of these right-wing forces. And we talked a great deal about that the other day, including in Ukraine, right? So now all I want to do is just kind of give you some data on the Russian and Ukrainian economies, because I think those are important. These are both, fairly substantial economies, Russia especially. So they have some importance in the global scene. When people talk about what Putin's motives are, a lot of this is psychological. He wants to create a greater Russia. He wants to do this and that and all that. I don't know. I've always been a bit wary of psychological interpretations. And I'm certainly no expert on Vladimir Putin's psyche or anything like that. But I think if you look at a map and you also look at data on the economy of those regions, then this makes a little more sense. And again, it doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but you ignore these kinds of things at your peril. And so Russia in 1999 is facing a world in which its economy is devastated. Inflation is rampant. This former kind of security programs like education and healthcare and all that have been kind of devastated. You have a small group of oligarchs now in control of the country, and Putin has no problem with them. By the way, he's one of them, right?
It's his base. It's his base.
It's his base, yeah. And you also have a situation in which, especially with the expansion of NATO, there is an increasing encirclement. If you look at those maps, there are more and more countries are joining NATO, and Russia, whether you agree with it or like it or not, Russia and the Soviet Union were invaded in 1914, and in 1941 there is this historical fear. Henry Kissinger said even paranoids have real enemies. And so there is this historical fear, and Ukraine is the big block in between that. By the time NATO is expanded, Ukraine is in between the NATO countries and Russia. And, I think it's important to understand too, because, I've been talking, a lot of people on the left have been talking about NATO for quite some time now, right? Because we've seen this coming. I mean, this issue didn't suddenly pop up. This didn't just suddenly occur in the past week. That's the point here, right? This has been building up the other day we said what's been building up since the 2014 coup in Ukraine. But I mean, going back further, and that's the point of what we're talking about today, it actually goes back to 1991, to the emergence of these new, autonomous states in that region and the breakup of the Soviet Union. So you kind of ignore that at your own peril. That is important. You don't have to like what Putin thinks to understand that there are, kind of global reasons that if you study political economy and if you study international relations, this stuff, like you just pointed out a minute ago, isn't really new. This is kind of an old script, and it makes things more understandable. Ukraine is a buffer in between Russia and these other states, and it also is an important economic partner with the Russians. And if let's say the if you know what's funny, well, to kind of go back to my point a minute ago, was like we've been saying for a long time, like this is about NATO. NATO is such a crucial issue. You can't understand this if you don't understand NATO. And everyone is saying, no, 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 this is because Putin is a madman, he's a psychopath, and all that kind of stuff, which may be true. But you know, it's kind of curious, isn't it, that these NATO liberals are so adamant on expanding NATO, and they have been for 30 years. So if you're that adamant about expanding NATO and going into these new areas and going into Georgia and going into Ukraine, if it's that important to the West, to these NATO liberals, then why is it illegitimate to say that it's also that important to Putin to not let that happen, right? Isn't there a corresponding, interest there? Right?
Reaction or action and reaction, that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, if the West is so adamant about expanding NATO, then why wouldn't Russia be equally concerned, if not panicking, about that same expansion of NATO? And again, there may be moral issues, and we don't believe in simplistic good versus bad things. I mean, we know Putin's bad. That's very easy. That's an easy decision a conclusion to draw, but that doesn't explain 30 years of conflict either. So just some economic data to give you some sense of what we're talking about, because, unlike something like Yemen or Palestine or Somalia, or even, Venezuela or Cuba, we're talking about bigger economies here. And the United States is currently in the process of putting the most intense sanctions on Russia, which will only match those of Iran, which is also interesting, right? Because, Iran, which does have oil at least, is nowhere near the global pariah or the global threat that Russia is, because Russia, again, it's important to understand the region here. Ukraine is really important to the West because of where it is. And that's very simplistic, but it's also very true. You're not going to see next week, Saturday Night Live is not going to open with a chorus singing, Palestinian liberation hymns or the Yemeni national anthem or anything like that. Those regions don't matter, whereas Ukraine in that part of the world absolutely does. Just like when Woodrow Wilson talked about self-determination, in World War I, he wasn't talking about the Middle East or Africa or Asia. He was talking about the Balkans, right? Which were heavily, already heavily, well, not heavily, but being developed, more heavily developed, certainly than the third world, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, Russia's GDP is currently estimated to be, well, before this, so I'm not sure where it is today, but it was currently about $1.6 trillion. And it has been rising a bit. Per capita GDP peaked in 2019 at about 12,000 US dollars, and it's gone down in 2020. A lot of that obviously due to COVID. I don't know where it stands today, but it's obviously much further down. However, during the pandemic, Russia saw something happen that also happened in the United States and in France and everywhere else, which was these oligarchs, these super rich, saw their wealth soar, and more so even in Russia. So the Russian oligarchs, whatever you want to call them, had about 23% of the GDP in 2020, and that went up to about 35% by the end of last year, just a few months ago. In the US, by comparison, the percentage of wealth held by oligarchs went from 13% to 19%. Russia also has more offshore wealth, which is also important too, because this is how you hide things. And we did that show, remember last year, on the Pandora Papers, which I think reflects that, right? Russia also had more offshore wealth. It has, I believe, almost twice as much offshore wealth as household wealth in country. So I think that's crucial to understand too, because these Russian oligarchs are taking their money, they're putting it elsewhere. You also have significant, I'll talk about that in a minute, Western money coming in to Russia and to Ukraine. So those are the numbers on Russia. Ukraine is much poorer than Russia. Household per capita income is about $2,200 there, and I don't know what it is today. It was about 2,600 in 2013, which was its record high. Both of these countries have a fairly significant level of exports, especially in agricultural products, cottonseed oil and sunflower seeds, which may not sound important, but they are certainly not trivial in terms of global trade. Russia has 39% of sunflower seed, safflower, cottonseed trade. Ukraine 18%. Wheat 18%. Russia has 18% of global wheat exports. That's a big deal. Barley, 12%. Linseed, 23%. Ukraine has 12% of global barley exports. Ukraine has 13% of global corn exports. And Russia has 13% of global fertilizer exports. So the short point there is that we're talking about places that are significantly important in terms of the global economy. Now, with regard to the US and Russia, there's a significant amount of trade. In 2019, and again, that's the last year where the stats are really meaningful, because with the pandemic, everything gets kind of squirreled up. But US goods and services in 2019 between the United States and Russia amounted to about $35 billion, fairly significant. Exports from the US were 11 billion, imports were 24 billion. So there's clearly a trade deficit with regard to Russia. Goods and services had a trade deficit of $13 billion. So Russia has a trade advantage with the United States. Currently, Russia is 26th largest goods partner with the United States, $28 billion in trade. Goods exports in 2019 were 5.8 billion, imports 22 billion. So again, significant deficit. And trade and services is significant as well, about $7 billion. And again, there is a deficit. With regard to exports, Russia was about the 40th largest export market in 2019. So the United States exports, that's the 40th largest amount of exports come from Russia. The top export categories were machinery, aircraft, vehicles, optical and medical instruments, and electrical machinery. U.S. exports of agricultural products to Russia, we're talking about U.S. exports to Russia right now, total 193 million, which is not a lot. And that included prepared food, seeds, tobacco, and some other stuff. And service exports were 5.1 billion, which is more significant. With regard to imports, Russia is more important. Russia was, and I know this is not the most exciting stuff, but I think it's important to give you a context for the kind of economic importance that these countries have. And, Scott, if you want to chime in with a joke or something to break the monotony of all this data, feel free. But it's really important. And I often tell my class, I talk a lot about like resources and minerals. And it's like, this is not exciting stuff. There's no way to make this exciting, but this is like the people who control the world. This is what they're talking about, right?
Yeah, it's important. It's important to note when we talk about the Cold War, we're not just talking about, when we're talking about Cold War, and then we're talking about this post-Cold War era, we're not just talking about, militaries preparing to go to war with each other, or the sexy spy James Bond kind of stuff. We're actually talking about is more this, these economic issues, and it's just an important thing to note. And when they were devising this new world order post World War II, this was very much what they had in mind. And when they were devising the new world order post 1991, this is very much what they had in mind. This is where the sort of real power and action, the real exchanges are happening.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll say in class, or even if I'm just talking to a group of people in the public, if there's a conflict going on and you want to find out what it's about, just figure out what that country has. What do you have over there? If you're in Bolivia, lithium. If you're in Chile, copper. I mean, once you kind of figure out what that country has or what resources exist, then it's a little easier to understand what the interests of these major powers are. So with regard to imports, then Russia was the U.S.'s 20th largest supplier of goods in 2019, and that totaled $22 billion. The top import categories, this is stuff coming from Russia to the United States, or mineral fuels, precious metal and stones, iron and steel, fertilizers, inorganic chemicals. Agricultural trade included snack foods, nuts, vegetable oils, and so forth. And then there were also services. The U.S. trade deficit, I think I mentioned already, was about $16 billion in 2019, which was a 16% increase over 2018. So the United States was, purchasing more goods from Russia. Direct investment, which I think is really important, foreign direct investment (FDI) was 14.4 billion in 2019, which is a fairly significant amount of money, especially in manufacturing, trade, and information. Russia's investment in the United States was 4.4 billion, which is not an insignificant amount of money either. Sales of services in Russia by majority U.S. affiliates were 9.7 billion. And the point in all this data is to just suggest that the United States and Russia have significant economic relationships, and there is clearly an interest there. And Russian control of Ukraine would clearly alter, not necessarily alter the balance of power, but clearly alter the equilibrium between the United States and Russia. With regard to Ukraine, the Ukraine was America's 59th largest goods exporter. The top categories there are things like mineral fuels, vehicles, machinery, seafood, seeds, prepared food, and dog and cat food even. So you get a lot of dog and cat food from Ukraine. Ukraine imported some goods from the United States, not a huge amount, iron and steel, electrical machinery, and so forth. But Ukraine is importing goods from America's allies in Europe, and I think that is important as well, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. I mean, I have a lot more here, but I don't want to really kind of bore you to death with more data. The point I wanted to make, just by throwing some of those numbers out, is there's a significant economic interest here. There are significant economic interests at stake here. And in fact, the most important, when I talk about privatization, was Gazprom, which I think is really crucial to all this. And I'm not going to talk much about it because I think we're going to do one of these, I like to call them debriefings on Gazprom and industry in particular. And again, I'm sorry if I'm coming across and I'm not that close and I need to get a mic. Every time I get a mic within 3 months, it crashes. So, but at any rate, we do want to talk about Gazprom and spend more time just on that issue by itself. But when I think I just want to mention that when that privatization occurred, one of the more important, I would say the most important industry was natural gas. In December of 1992, Gazprom was privatized, and it basically was given really obviously a sweetheart deal. Yeltsin and his cronies got it. Gazprom was not regulated very much by the state. That sounds like Texas. Gazprom did not pay taxes. Again, sounds like Texas.
That's where it's headed, right?
Right. The Texasization of Russia and Ukraine. Gazprom executives were engaged in asset stripping. You sell off parts of the company to cronies and things like that. Today, and I'm just going to skip ahead, Gazprom had sales of $120 billion in 2019. It is the largest publicly listed natural gas company in the world, the largest company in Russia by revenue, the 32nd largest company in the world. And Gazprom actually is again a public company. It was resold to the state, to Putin by Putin's cronies, to Putin's cronies. So it's technically a state company, but it's kind of one of these things where the debt is socialized, but the profits are privatized. At any rate, and that's really crucial because Europe is heavily reliant on Russia oil, which is why that was an issue in the assets with the freeze, right, with SWIFT, and that still hasn't been decided. Apparently, they are going to apply SWIFT now to the sanctions, but the issue of whether the sanctions are going to apply to energy still hasn't been settled, and I think that's really important as well. And so really, I don't want to kind of keep going on and on because there's a lot here, and I know that this hasn't been the most exciting stuff, but I think it's crucial to understand there is this larger context that started in 1991 that continues through today. Privatization is really an important and crucial element of that. That Russia, whether you like it or not, has seen countries on its borders join an opposing alliance, and these two places, in particular Georgia and now Ukraine, are clearly targeted by that same alliance, by NATO, that there are significant economic interests at play as well. And so one can condemn and should condemn Putin in the strongest terms possible. But to ignore these larger issues that people like Putin and others raise is perilous in kind of creating any kind of understanding of it, and maybe creating a pathway to try to get out of this before a lot more innocent, working class kids in Ukraine and Russia and who knows where else, if other countries send troops in, are going to be slaughtered. So that's why, I think it's important to talk about this and to give you this fairly brief backgrounder on it. Maybe it wasn't the sexiest stuff in the world, but it's really important. So, and we'll be doing, I think, more of these because I don't think this crisis is going to end anytime immediately. So we'll probably be doing more of these, and we thank you. And, please share these. It is a viewpoint that I think you're not going to hear in a lot of places. And I think we do know a bit about this. We're not just, Googling things and telling you what we heard on the street or repeating what you're going to hear on MSNBC and CNN or Fox or wherever. So thanks. And if you have any ideas or any questions, please send them along.
Yeah. You definitely won't be hearing what we're talking about on Fox. That's for sure.
No, that is the pro-Putin. They are insane. They are utterly insane.
Yeah. Folks, you've been listening to Bob Bazenko with Green and Red Podcast, giving a little background on Russia and the economics and history of privatization in Russia. You've been listening to the Green and Red Podcast. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button. And if you want to make a donation, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenandredpodcast. We will talk to all of you again soon, and look for these little backgrounders. We'll be doing more of these in the coming weeks.